navigate the stage. And ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests, welcome to Balloons and Bombs, very kindly sponsored by Folkington's Juices. My name is Alistair Burtonshaw. I'm the new director here at Charleston, and it's wonderful to be able to introduce what looks all set to be one of the most dramatic topics of this year's festival. But before we start, I have a few very quick housekeeping announcements, if I may. Please could you just take a moment to note the location of the fire exits within the marquee. In the very unlikely event that we need to evacuate, please could you follow the instructions of Charleston staff, who'll direct you to a safe assembly point. I'd also be very grateful if you could just take a moment now to check that your mobile phones are off before we start. And that includes speakers. Okay, well, welcome to this session. Ray Monk is a philosopher and biographer. He has taught at the University of Southampton since 1992, where he is Professor of Philosophy, winner of both the 1990 John Llewellyn Rhys Prize and the 1991 Duff Cooper Prize for Ludwig Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius. His interests lie in the philosophy of mathematics, the history of analytical philosophy, and philosophical aspects of biographical writing. His new biography, Inside the Center, A Life of J Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, has been much praised, with the Daily Telegraph claiming, after reading this book, some will judge Oppenheimer a colossus, others will think him an ass, all will find him fascinating. Richard Holmes is a British author and academic best known for his biographical studies of major figures of British and French Romanticism. A fellow of both the Royal Society of Literature and the British Academy, he was Professor of Biographical Studies at the University of East Anglia until 2007 and has honorary doctorates from the University of East London, University of Kingston and the Tavistock Institute. In 1992, he was awarded an OBE. Holmes' major works of romantic biography include Shelley, The Pursuit, winner of the Somerset Maugham Award in 1974, Coleridge, Early Visions, winner of the 1989 Whitbread Book of the Year Prize, now the Costa, Coleridge, Darker Reflections, the second and final volume of his Coleridge biography, winner of the Duff Cooper Prize, and the Heinemann Award, and Dr. Johnson and Mr. Savage, on the friendship between 18th century British literary figures Samuel Johnson and Richard Savage, which won the James Tait Black Prize. His 2008 biography, The Age of Wonder, How the Romantic Generation Discovered the Beauty and Terror of Science, explored the scientific ferment that swept across Britain at the end of the 18th century, and his latest book is Falling Upwards, How the Romantics Took to the Air, which tells of the bravery of the pioneer balloonists that we shall be hearing more about today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Richard Holmes and Ray Monk for what will undoubtedly be a fascinating and thrilling discussion. Ray, over to you.
Right, well, thank you very much, Alistair, and I'd like to thank the organisers of this event for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come here, and it's a great honour to share a stage with Richard. The last time I was here was about 15 years ago, and I gave a talk about Bertrand Russell, whose birthday it is today, in fact. So before I start, I'd just like to say happy birthday to Bertie, who'll be 141 years old today. I'm here to talk about my book on Oppenheimer, Inside the Center, and fortuitously, perhaps, the title indicates a sort of theme that unites my book with Richard's, in this sense, that the reason I called my book Inside the Center was that, one of the reasons anyway, is that Oppenheimer always wanted to be inside the center, both of theoretical physics. He wanted to be where the leading advances were being made. He also, and this dictated certain decisions he made throughout his life, wanted to be inside the center of American political and cultural life. His tragedy was that he wasn't perceived to be a member of that central elite, and he always felt himself to be an outsider. Richard's book, on the other hand, is all about people who, I think for the most part, are happy to define themselves as outsiders. So Oppenheimer, the reason he the reason he was made to feel an outsider in American, the elite of American life, was because he was Jewish. When he applied to study at Cambridge, the reference written by his lecturer Percy Bridgman said, "As you can tell from his name, Mr. Oppenheimer is a Jew." And that name, identified him as Jewish. Oppenheimer is the name that the Jews from the town of Oppenheim, which is a very pleasant town you can see in the Rhineland area of Germany. It's the wine growing area, and it's a very nice place. But the Jews there, like the Jews in most of Germany, felt themselves to be outsiders, and for a long time they tried to organize themselves so that the things that separated them from the rest of German society were overcome. They made a conscious effort to overcome those barriers by, for example, instituting German as their language of worship rather than the Yiddish or the original language. And this poem by Goethe expresses the feeling that Jews had when that Jewish enlightenment came to nothing, and they turned their attention not towards overcoming the barriers in Germany, but to seeking in America a new life. So America became a sort of symbol for the German Jewish families of a kind of freedom from oppression, a freedom from history, a sort of blank page on which they could write their own destiny. And that's what this poem expresses. And this poem became very popular, and the movement became very popular. It formed, in fact, the second migration of Jews into the United States. The first Jewish community in the United States was the Sephardic Jews who'd been expelled from Spain and Portugal. The German Jews formed the second migration, which was much, much larger. There were about 15,000 Sephardic Jews in the States by 1840. 40 years later, there were 280,000 Jews, most of whom were Germans who'd arrived during those 40 years. And then the third wave of migration was the Jews who were quite literally fleeing for their lives from Russia and Poland, and that was on a different scale altogether. By 1920, there were 2.5 million Jews in the States, the vast majority of whom were Eastern European. Oppenheimer's early life was to some extent shaped by that division between the uptown Jews, the German Jews who lived on the Upper West Side, which is where he was brought up, and the downtown Jews, the Polish and Russian Jews. As there was a tussle between the two as to who should control the Jewish community and what kind of identity it was being Jewish. The European Jews had not sought to, like the German Jews, shake off disadvantages, overcome differences. What they wanted was freedom to pursue their life, including going to the synagogue and so on. Whereas the German Jews, their history for the previous 100 years had been one of earnest efforts at assimilation. And Oppenheimer was a perfect example of that. The world regarded him as a German Jew. He didn't regard himself as either German or Jewish. His main allegiance was to America. His father was Julius Oppenheimer, who came to the States aged 17 in 1888, following his uncles, and this was a typical trend. His uncles had set up a tailoring business in New York City, and Julius Oppenheimer arrived and within a very short space of time had worked his way up that business, which was flourishing. One thing that had helped it flourish actually was the American Civil War, and then later on the First World War, providing uniforms. The company became very successful. Julius Oppenheimer became very rich enough to move into this property here, 155 Riverside Drive, which is an enormously valuable piece of real estate then as now. That address, actually, 155 Riverside Drive, has become famous among some people, fans of sitcoms, because it's the address of Will and Grace. And Will and Grace lived on the 9th floor. The Oppenheimers owned the entire 11th floor. And it was furnished in some considerable style. Oppenheimer's mother had studied art, and with the fortune she'd acquired from marrying Julius Oppenheimer, she bought Renoirs, she bought Van Goghs, she bought Picassos. The apartment on the 11th floor had an art collection that would be worth many millions of pounds now. When Oppenheimer's brother, who had joined the Communist Party, lost his job, he had only to sell one of these paintings to provide in great style for himself and his family for the rest of his life. Intellectually and spiritually, the dominant influence on Oppenheimer during his early years was the ethical culture movement, which was a movement set up by Felix Adler, who was the son of a rabbi, the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, which was a synagogue that all the uptown Jews, the German Jews, went to. And he formed a sort of split-away movement, at the heart of which was a determination to preserve what was best in their tradition, their Jewish tradition, which he regarded as the ethical part, the part that was all about duty to other people, being a good citizen and so on, separating that from questions of belief. And so the ethical culture movement was a conscious attempt to, as Adler put it, create a religion not of creed but of deed, a religion defined not what one believed but what one did. So Oppenheimer grew up in this apartment. It was tremendously wealthy. They lacked for nothing. He had given intellectual and spiritual education guided by the principles of the ethical culture movement. One thing he didn't have much of in his childhood was fun. He didn't have a huge number of playmates. This is a very unusual photograph showing him playing with another young boy, doing one of the things he liked doing, which was building bricks. He also liked writing poetry, and he also liked collecting rocks, which was a big passion of his. And he was intellectually precocious, and he became an expert at a very young age in rocks, so that at the age of 12, he was invited to address the learned society in New York on geology. And they had the surprise of their lives when he turned up at 12 years old in short trousers. He went to the ethical culture school rather late. He didn't start there till he was 12 years old. And although all the other kids came from exactly the same background as he did, they all came from the Upper West Side, they all came from German Jewish families, nevertheless, he felt himself to be an outsider even there, partly because I think he'd grown up without much company of other children, and partly because he was so very intellectually precocious. A schoolmate of his remembers him saying, "Ask me a question in Latin and I'll give you the answer in Greek," which is very impressive, but not the way to earn friends as a 12-year-old boy. And the one friend he did make, significantly, was a boy called Francis Ferguson, who was the one boy at the school who didn't come from that background. Francis Ferguson came from a background that's as different from that as it's possible to imagine. He came from the Southwest. He came from New Mexico. His family was a very distinguished, pioneering family in New Mexico. They'd gone over. They'd had all the sort of adventures that they then wrote about. Crossing the Santa Fe Trail, and all of that. His father then became the first representative of the new state of New Mexico in the House of Representatives, and they lived in the oldest adobe building in Albuquerque in New Mexico. And so they're a very prominent family in that part of the country. When Oppenheimer finished school at the Ethical Culture School, he spent some time in New Mexico as a guest of the Fergusons, which then determined, many years later, where the atomic bomb laboratory was going to be, because he fell in love with New Mexico. He fell in love with the countryside, with the people, with the traditions, with the way of life. He learned to ride a horse. He rode for, days on end, and became very much the Southwesterner. In 1922, he went to Harvard. 1922, I discovered when I was researching this book, was a significant year for precisely, the kind of students that Oppenheimer was one of, which was Harvard in 1922 sought to restrict the number of Jews they were admitting because they cast an eye over at Columbia University where the number of Jews had risen to 40%. And President Lowell of Harvard was determined that it wouldn't happen there. And so he wanted to institute quotas, and he wanted to do it surreptitiously, but his faculty objected, and it became a public debate, and through the New York Times and other papers, a national debate. What's striking, though, reading Oppenheimer's letters, is that he took no part in that debate whatsoever. He doesn't even mention that this hoo-ha is going on at Harvard when he writes to his parents or his friends or his teachers. What he seemed most concerned to do was not to enter into that debate, but to stand aside from it and almost pretend to be not part of it. He did his best to disguise the fact that he was Jewish, but it couldn't happen. So he wasn't allowed, no matter how wealthy, no matter how intellectually precocious, he wasn't allowed into the best halls of residence in Harvard. He could only join one that was specifically marked out for Jewish students. And so despite his best endeavors, the people he knew at Harvard, who were very small, were just like him. One of his best friends was Frederick Bernheim, who went there to do chemistry, who came from exactly the same background as Oppenheimer, lived on Riverside Drive, was from a very wealthy family, had been to the ethical culture school, and so on. Oppenheimer went there to do chemistry, and so his friends were chemists, William Boyd and Frederick Bernheim, both of whom became very distinguished chemists later on in life. However, at the end of his first year, Oppenheimer developed an interest in physics, and so asked the physics department if he could attend graduate level courses in physics. This was an extraordinarily unusual request. He'd become fascinated just through independent reading in the then young science of quantum physics, by which I mean not the quantum mechanics developed later on by Heisenberg, but what's called the old quantum theory developed by Einstein and Planck, at the heart of which was the idea that light consists not of waves but of little packets of energy called photons. That was the original quantum theory, and Oppenheimer became very fascinated by it and asked for special permission to attend these graduate level courses. And unusually, the department gave him permission, which partly explains, I think, an oddity in Oppenheimer's abilities and disabilities in physics. Wolfgang Pauli, the great physicist, said about Oppenheimer, his physics is always fascinating and interesting, but his calculations are always wrong. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that Oppenheimer didn't have the usual kind of background for a top-level physicist. He didn't. There was a whole level of education that he didn't have. He catapulted himself straight from being a first-year chemistry undergraduate to, as it were, being a graduate-level student of physics. So his knowledge of physics was way in advance what he could do at a basic level in mathematics. I mean, I say that, Oppenheimer's mathematics is several orders higher than my own, so I'm in no position to be condescending about that. But Oppenheimer's mathematics was fallible, to say the least, when compared with the great physicists like Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, and so on. And I think the oddity of his undergraduate education partly explains that. He wanted to be inside the centre, as I said, and the centre of physics in those days was the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, presided over by the great New Zealand physicist Ernest Rutherford, who completely changed the way we see the structure of the atom. It was Rutherford who first hypothesized that we should see the atom as having at its nucleus a positively charged core around which the negatively charged electrons go, like a sort of planetary system. Now, the problem was that Rutherford was the head of a laboratory. Rutherford was an experimental physicist. Oppenheimer certainly wasn't. And the reference that I mentioned before from Percy Bridgman, apart from pointing out, which was of no interest to Rutherford at all, that Oppenheimer was a Jew, also pointed out, which was of interest, that Oppenheimer was no good in the laboratory. And so Rutherford actually rejected Oppenheimer, which was his first taste of academic rejection in his life. Nevertheless, Christ's College, Cambridge, accepted him, and so he was in a slightly humiliating position of going to Cambridge as an undergraduate, still wanting to pursue research. But he wasn't allowed to be one of Rutherford's researchers. And the The year that he spent at Cambridge, 25, 26, was the most unhappy of his life. And this, two things. One is that he'd experienced rejection for the first time. Secondly, he experienced for the first time again being unable to meet the objectives that had been set for him. This man, Patrick Blackett, was a very great experimental physicist, appointed by Rutherford to teach Oppenheimer the ropes. The problem was that Oppenheimer just could not, he just didn't have within him what's required to do laboratory work. And that induced in Oppenheimer a deep misery that came close to psychosis. What you find in that year, 25, 26, is Oppenheimer behaving, I mean, to say that he behaved bizarrely is to put it mildly. It began with students seeing him, he gave a presentation at the laboratory, and they remember him standing in front of the blackboard with a piece of chalk in his hand, just repeating over and over again, the point is, the point is, the point is, until somebody ushered him away. And it got even stranger. He then apparently tried to kill PMS Blackett by leaving on his desk a poisoned apple. Which is a charge with significance, of course, symbolic significance. He was summoned by the Cambridge authorities to them, and remarkably, they didn't expel him altogether, but they said, you can stay at Cambridge University only so long as you receive psychiatric help, which he did. During the Christmas vacation, though, he behaved just as oddly. He'd arranged to see his friend Francis Ferguson in Paris, and when they were in their hotel room together, he grabbed a piece of leather and put it around Ferguson's neck and tried to strangle him. Amazingly, I mean, Ferguson was bigger and stronger than Oppenheimer and shook him off. And amazingly, Ferguson forgave Oppenheimer for that, and they stayed friends, despite the fact that Oppenheimer tried to kill him. What's really remarkable, though, is that within a couple of months of that, Oppenheimer had gone from being this crazy person undergoing these psychotic episodes to being one of the most gifted young physicists at Cambridge. And what had effected that transformation is not the psychiatric help he received, but rather his move from experimental physics, which he was no good at, to theoretical physics, which first of all he was very good at, and secondly was undergoing its most exciting period. That year, 25-26, has been called the year of Knabenphysik, the year of boys' physics. It was a year when very young people, people in their 20s, were making fundamental changes to the way we see physical processes and physical matter, including, for example, Werner Heisenberg, who first brought forward in these years the uncertainty principle, the principle that you can't accurately measure both the momentum and the position of a subatomic particle. The idea that we should see subatomic particles like electrons as both waves and particles. All these revolutionary ideas that were being developed in this year, and Oppenheimer, just by chance in a way, because he'd gone there because of Rutherford, but he ended up being right at the center of things, not because of Rutherford, but because of this man, Paul Dirac, who gave the first set of lectures in that year on quantum mechanics. Oppenheimer attended the lectures, became absolutely obsessed with quantum mechanics, forgot about his experimental work, and just spent all his time talking about wave-particle dualism and the strange behavior of electrons and matrix mechanics and all these exciting new ideas that were being developed. He was discussing them with Paul Dirac and became an expert in them, so that when, in May 1926, some of the leading physicists in the world visited Cambridge, they found that they could discuss these new ideas with Oppenheimer as an equal. And Oppenheimer was, just a first-year graduate student. Two of the most significant people to come, Niels Bohr was the great Danish physicist, and Oppenheimer formed an admiration for Niels Bohr that lasted throughout his life. Niels Bohr was probably the person above all others whom Oppenheimer admired, and the admiration started in May 1926, carried on right until his death in 1967. More decisively for his career, Max Born visited Cambridge in the same year. Max Born was a great physicist based in Göttingen in Germany, who had been responsible for understanding the strange behavior that was being uncovered in quantum mechanics. Born was the first person to put forward a probabilistic interpretation for the behavior of electrons. It was this idea, and it was in Einstein's correspondence with Max Born that Einstein uttered the famous remark, God does not play dice. So Born was right at the center of it, and Born invited Oppenheimer to come to Göttingen with him, said, well, if you're unhappy in Cambridge, why don't you come to Göttingen and do your PhD, which Oppenheimer was only too pleased to do. He went to Göttingen. Within a few months, he'd finished his PhD, and by the end of that year, was one of the most sought-after physicists in the United States, who were very keen to have people who'd learnt with the best physicists on the continent of Europe to come to America. So Oppenheimer did, and after a period in Zurich with Wolfgang Pauli himself, where again he was at the right place because Wolfgang Pauli was developing what became quantum electrodynamics, the most successful physical theory ever developed, and Oppenheimer was right there at the birth of that. He came back to the States, was in such high demand that he was able to dictate his own terms, which were that he spent 6 months at Berkeley, 6 months at Caltech. Caltech because it was full of good scientists, Berkeley because it wasn't, and at Berkeley he could develop his own school of physicists, which he did, and Berkeley became the leading school of physics in the United States, partly because of the relationship that Oppenheimer had with this man, Ernest Lawrence, who wasn't a great theoretical physicist, but was a great experimentalist and also a great mover and shaker. And Lawrence was brilliant at getting big money to come to Berkeley to fund his... Lawrence won the Nobel Prize for inventing the cyclotron, an early particle accelerator. And Lawrence used the big money to build bigger and bigger cyclotrons. And Lawrence and Oppenheimer became friends. And at Berkeley, you had this blossoming that was driven by theoretical physics and experimental physics working hand in hand. Meanwhile, he kept up his interest in New Mexico and bought this house in New Mexico. While he was developing his school of graduate physicists at Berkeley, Oppenheimer developed an interest in politics, which before that he hadn't been interested in at all. He didn't even know that the Wall Street crash had happened in 1929. But in the 1930s, he started to notice these incredibly bright young men that he was teaching weren't getting good jobs. They were getting manual labor jobs. They were earning a very poor wage, hardly enough to keep body and soul together. In response, they were joining the Communist Party, and that prompted Oppenheimer not to join the Communist Party, but to engage himself in radical left-wing politics, aided and abetted by his first lover, Jean Tatlock, his close friend, Harcon Chevalier, who taught French at Berkeley. And that picture in the middle of his students, Joe Weinberg, Rossi Lominitz, David Bohm, Max Friedman, that picture was to have an unfortunate effect on the lives of everybody concerned. It was taken by a street photographer. They were outside Berkeley's campus. They thought it would be a nice idea to have their picture taken, little knowing that because Rossi Lominitz was known to the FBI, Rossi Lominitz was being followed everywhere by an FBI agent. When the four of them moved on, the agent went up to the street photographer and said, "I'll have your camera, thank you very much," and put that photograph in the file. They then tracked down these students, and that photograph and their association with Rossi Lominitz then dominated their entire lives. They found that they couldn't get jobs, and when they did get jobs, they were suddenly withdrawn at the last minute, and so on. Meanwhile, the FBI were also following Oppenheimer. I looked through Oppenheimer's entire FBI file, which is absolutely huge and absolutely fascinating. Once they realized that he associated with communists and with top-level communists and gave money to top-level communists, they bugged his home phone, his work phone, they put microphones in his house, they followed him wherever he went. In the process, they compiled an absolutely brilliant biographical resource, which was of no interest to the national security of the United States, but it did allow me to eavesdrop on almost every conversation he had. Despite all of that, he became, and I'm very short of time, so excuse me if I rattle through, but despite all of that, he became director of the Los Alamos laboratory to develop the first atomic bomb. Now, he was the least likely person in the world to do that. He was hopeless in the laboratory. He hadn't run anything. Somebody said Oppenheimer had never run so much as a hamburger stall, let alone a laboratory. And J. Edgar Hoover, the head of FBI, was saying, look, don't appoint this man. He's a communist. He'll give all the secrets to the Soviets. Despite all of that, he was appointed, and the reason why he was appointed was because of this man, General Groves. When General Groves assumed command of the Manhattan Project, he arranged to see the scientists involved, and they were very distinguished people, Harold Urey, Ernest Lawrence, Enrico Fermi, and so on. But Groves was very disappointed with them. First of all, he couldn't understand a word they said. And secondly, they showed no urgency about getting a bomb built. And then when he met Oppenheimer, Oppenheimer was brilliant at explaining difficult things to non-specialists. And he gave Groves a course on fission and how the forces in fission might be used to make a bomb. And he also showed a sense of urgency about getting a bomb built, and that was enough for Groves, despite everything else he'd heard from scientists about Oppenheimer not quite being, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, despite what he'd heard from J. Edgar Hoover about him being a security leak. Despite all of that, Groves said, no, this is the man. And Groves was absolutely right. I'll skip over the stuff about isotopes, fascinating though it is. Groves turned out to be absolutely right. Oppenheimer was, despite what anybody might think, ideally suited for the purpose. And one reason for that is that he wasn't a narrow specialist and was able to understand the problems of everybody in Los Alamos, whether they were, designing a creche or whether they were trying to get a building done, whether they were studying the properties of plutonium, or whether they were trying to build a gun assembly design to get a bomb made. Whatever it was, everybody says they only had to talk to Oppenheimer for 5 minutes for him to understand what the problem was and to offer a solution to it. Remarkably, within 2 years, they had a working bomb, and actually 2 different designs of a working bomb. They had a uranium bomb, which they didn't even bother testing because they were so sure that the science would work, and they had a plutonium bomb, which was tested at Trinity. The plutonium bomb was the fat man. The uranium bomb was the little boy. Little boy exploded over Hiroshima. Fat man over Nagasaki. By the end of the war, Oppenheimer had replaced Einstein as the most famous physicist in the United States. So famous that when Physics Today started, all they had to do was photograph his hat on a cyclotron, and everyone understood that was Oppenheimer. He left California, went to Princeton, mainly so that he could be on the East Coast, so that he could advise politicians at Washington on nuclear policy, and in the process made some very dangerous enemies because he advised them not to develop the hydrogen bomb, and he alienated in the process Edward Teller, who was who became the scientist the government trusted on these things, and the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Lewis Strauss, and also various incredibly powerful military people, all of whom were strongly suspicious of Oppenheimer, not only because of his left-wing past, but also because he was advising the government not to develop the hydrogen bomb. His argument for that was, why on earth would you want a hydrogen bomb? It's, a hydrogen bomb is potentially thousands of times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, which is already more powerful than anybody could possibly have imagined beforehand. There's no possible circumstance in which you would, dream of using such a bomb. So why would you want to develop it? As a result of the suspicion he aroused, in 1954, he was subject to a security clearance hearing, which decided that he was a security leak, despite having, seen through the development of the bombs. He had his security clearance taken away from him. He was then a broken man because his greatest passion was his patriotic feeling for the United States of America. However, fairly quickly, the reconciliation was made, the first step of which was a television program done by Ed Murrow, which introduced Oppenheimer to an audience of millions, and they could see what a charming and erudite man he was, who was brilliant at explaining theoretical physics. And that made him into a kind of hero. He then gave a series of public lectures in which his audience numbered not tens or hundreds, but thousands. He was addressing audiences of sometimes 25,000 people. He was invited back to Japan in 1960. You can see there the effect that the security clearing had on him. This is 1960. He's 56 years old there. He looks more like 86. He lost a lot of weight. He became emaciated. He succumbed to cancer. He was a very heavy smoker, sometimes 60 cigarettes a day. The final reconciliation a few years before his death was when he was awarded the Enrico Fermi Prize. And there was a famous photograph of Edward Teller, who'd been his enemy for the previous 10 years, rushing up to him to congratulate him. You can see Oppenheimer looking gracious in the face of that, and his wife Kitty rather less so. And I just want to finish with this quotation. He died in 1967 of cancer. In the summer of 1960, he gave a sort of surprisingly personal talk in which he said, "If I cannot be comforted by Vishnu's argument to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, it is because I'm too much of a Jew, much too much a Christian, much too much a European, far too much an American. For I believe in the meaningfulness of human history and of our role in it, and above all, of our responsibility to it." Thank you.
Well, Ray's subject might be described as heavier than air, and mine is lighter than air. And I put on my special balloon striped candy shirt for your honor. Ballooning sounds like, and indeed is, a curious subject. But I found that it led in the most unusual directions. I found also that throughout the 19th century, which is the main subject, people had felt the same. They felt ambiguous about ballooning. My book opens with a section called Voices That Can Now Be Heard. We had, of course, practiced that beforehand. Joseph Montgolfier described a balloon, it's all you need to know about balloons. He said, a balloon is a cloud in a paper bag. That's all you need to know about a balloon. And Benjamin Franklin, someone asked me, what's the use of a balloon? You may be asking that question yourselves. And his reply is wonderful. He replied, what's the use of a newborn baby? That's good. The poet William Cowper, I would make it death for a man to be convicted of flying the moment he could be caught. And that's a wonderful phrase to attach to it. The wonderful quotations from Turner, see if you can guess who this is, just for last but one voice overhead. How should I manage all my business if I were obliged to marry? I never should know French, or go to America, or go up in a balloon. Charles Darwin. Interesting, interesting. And finally, to set the pitch, this is an article, a learned editorial that appeared in Blackwood's magazine in 1864, which is a key date, as we'll see. It begins thus: next to the climbers of the Alpine Club, in order of utter uselessness, are the people who go up in balloons and who come down to tell us of the temperature, the air currents, the shape of the clouds, the amount of atmospheric pressure in a region where nobody wants to go, nor has the slightest interest to hear about. And that's Blackwood's magazine. So those voices appear at the beginning of the book. But one of the reasons I chose it, I'll try and get my space organized here, is because a characteristic of the balloon is that it is a carrier not only of people, but of stories in the most extraordinary way. And I will try and illustrate that very briefly, and then suggest to you why there might be wider wider interests, wider perspectives that come out of this. Let me just show you this. That's the balloon cluster, which I use to illustrate the structure of the balloon book. It's full of stories which are aimed to gradually lift you off the ground. In fact, that balloon belonged to a Brazilian priest, Padre Balonero, who decided to go up in his final model, carried by 1,000 helium party balloons in order to raise money for a truck driver's rest stop and spiritual center. He went up equipped with a mobile phone, GPS nav, a special seat, flotation devices, and at the end of the day, about 7 o'clock in the evening, he contacted the Brazilian Coast Guard by his mobile phone. And he said, I'm at 19,000 feet and getting closer to God. And I'm very cold. And the terrible thing is that was the last that was heard of him. I won't give you the details how he was found, but something very interesting happened, that he had an extraordinary effect on his parishioners. He raised more money for this truck stop center and spiritual center, and it was successfully launched. And this is a very characteristic thing about balloons. Disaster and triumph change hands very, very easily. And for storytelling, as a storytelling biographer, this is particularly interesting. Let me give you one more example of this. Can you all see that? Yes, there. So my question is, what's the story? What's the story there? What might have happened? Is he trying to fly? Had they had a row? Was he hungry for dinner? There's a range of possibilities. In fact, it's a French print of a real flight, took place in 1824, starting in London. Gentleman was Lieutenant Harris of the Royal Navy, and the lady was Miss Stocks, who was his fiancée, a very beautiful young woman. And they were making this as their sort of pre-wedding flight, all right? Now, there's only one problem, is that Lieutenant Harris had organized and invented a very new form of rip cord, which released the gas from the hydrogen balloon very, very rapidly, so that when they were on the ground, it wouldn't bounce along and shake up Miss Stocks, which he obviously didn't want to do. And what actually happened is that he pulled the cord by mistake when they were about 600 feet up, and the balloon dropped. And what this picture is actually of is Lieutenant Harris of the Royal Navy jumping out just before impact in an attempt to lighten the blow for Miss Stocks. And he succeeded. He was killed and Miss Stocks survived fine. And again, is that a triumph or a tragedy? So just in storytelling elements are very interesting to write about. The book moves right across French ballooning, English ballooning, ballooning from my own county, and this extraordinary story. This is all at the beginning of the book, trying to open it up. This is an amazing story of two East German families, 1979, who wanted to get across the wall, who had tried it by hiding in a Volkswagen. They couldn't do it, so they decided to build a hot air balloon. They built 3 versions of this balloon. They had to drive all over East Germany to collect the materials without raising suspicions of the Stasis. Basically, it was made of counterpanes, taffeta, and tent material. And the third model, which is powered by those 4 propane tanks you can see, could just about lift off the 2 families. The very efficient basket, as you see, is actually pieces of washing line strung around. They launched at night from the Thuringen Forest, about 18 miles from the border, with the wind blowing in the right way, westwards towards freedom. They turned on their homemade burner. They went up to 9,000 feet, switched off, and hoped they would float over the wall. The fence, of course, was there. But if you're in a balloon at night, The balloon turns all the time on its axis. It's dark. You don't know where you're going. And they didn't know where they were going. Then suddenly below them, searchlights appeared. And so they had a choice. Should they remain without turning their burner back on so they're dark, but they're going down fairly rapidly? Or should they put the burner on and try and rise above it? They decided to turn the burner on. I point out there's 3 children in there, one a child in arms, all right? So the decision taking here was rather critical. The balloon sailed up to something like 15,000 feet, and the top of the balloon, under the pressure, caught fire. So now at 15,000 feet, the 2 families, somewhere, they weren't quite sure where they were, and remarkably, the pilot, first time flying, he decided to continue with the burner. It was a good move because the material at the top was canvas for tenting, which is impregnated with it. It didn't burn very quickly. So they managed to keep flying, and the searchlights, they weren't quite sure where they were, but they didn't seem to find them. They finally came down in a field, still in the dark. They landed reasonably safely. One of the adults broke their leg, but they didn't know where they were. So the chap who'd broken his leg saw through the dark a shape which was a pylon. He limped across the field. The pylon had a big notice saying danger of death, and then he looked, and the company who made the pylon was a West German company. They were free. And it's a wonderful story, and Disney made a great film out of it. So these are just stories. Basically, my book is about 19th century, but I wanted to get people to think about balloons in a rather different light. This one is a story from my own home county. I'm going to just take the watch here, so keep in time. This is a Norfolk story, slightly similar to Padre Balonero. All I'll tell you about it, this is Major Money, a man who'd retired from the Hussars, who amazingly happened to be in the same regiment as the young Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a very interesting connection to me, who decided to raise money for the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, who sent a balloon up in his first time he'd flown, hydrogen balloon, from Norwich, centre of Norwich. This is 1785, again to raise money. The wind direction changed. Instead of sailing gently towards Peterborough, he sailed straight out over the North Sea, all right? Boats followed him, but it was getting dark. They lost him, and he landed in the sea about 25 miles off the land. And this picture is of him gradually sinking. And the extraordinary thing is there's one boat which came out from Southwold, was skippered by a chap who understood something about balloons, a very simple thing. The balloon will go down the line of the wind. You can't navigate it, but it'll go down the line of the wind. So with a boat, you set the sails and you sail it right down the line of the wind. So he sailed till midnight, and he knew the moon would come up. And sure enough, he found Major Money. By this time, suffering from hypothermia, and up to his chin is the description, completely incoherent. They hauled him out, gave him a good dose of brandy. Jokes were exchanged immediately. They took him back the next day. He was a hero in Southwold. He raised more money for the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, et cetera, which I may say they still need. So, again, that's that thing to... I'm just trying to leap forward. So, okay, 10 minutes. That's enough possibly to give you some idea that the book has unexpected elements in it. Let's go on. What you actually see from a balloon, this is rather interesting. This is an image I found in the British Museum. It's the first actual drawing. It's a painting, colour painting by Thomas Baldwin, same year as that Money, I think, 1785. It's actually above, it's just north of Liverpool. It's the River Mersey and Warrington. The water stream is red because it was made at sunset, and the light actually shows the colour of the earth through the water. And incidentally, that is something suddenly the balloonists began to realize you saw the earth completely differently. And this is a major theme of the book, seeing the earth differently. And it's an argument that goes right through to modern satellites. So they began to see the way towns were spreading differently, the way agriculture worked. And they also, he got very interested. This is the same drawing, but with, on your right-hand side there, his sort of analytic map of the path of his actual balloon, which it is, if you can see it, it's that little corkscrew line that starts on the bottom left and corkscrews up to the right. It doesn't fly along the line of the wind because it's over the river Mersey, and the river cools the air in a different way, so the balloon is drawn into it and out in a series of curves. So it's the first time they began to realize the importance of what became the upper air, okay, so which is again is a big theme of the book, discovering what is actually above us, what I call the kingdom of the air. Leap forward, and now trying to spread out so you begin to see directions in which this book goes. This is 1836. This is a famous flight made by Charles Greane from London, launching at 4 in the afternoon and deliberately trying to fly onto the continent and see how far they could get. And they flew all night. They flew over Dover, across the Channel, and then the wind took them due east. And they went through Belgium and Germany, and they thought they were going to Poland and Russia. And this, very beautiful, I think, and this is another aspect about balloons are amazingly, what we call it, photogenic or graphic genius. And I've managed to, in the book, research this. I think we've got 140 pictures, which was absolutely fascinating because it's like a social history, French, German, English, American. And this particular one was they were flying these curious little smoky little bird's tails affairs. It's the river Meuse on the left-hand side. They're over Liège, which was the old Belgian textile town. And in the last 10 years, it had been transformed by being turned into the biggest iron foundry, center of iron foundry in Northern Europe. And what they were flying over was these smoking iron foundries which work 24 hours a day. So they suddenly had a kind of vision of a new industrial society, very well described. First of all, simply in terms of seeing the city lit up at 3 in the morning, and then smelling the smell of smelting, hearing the laborers working down there, which was not entirely a happy noise. And one of them was a very good Irish writer called Monk Mason, who wrote the most wonderful descriptions of this. And we'll come back to him in a moment if we have time. So they overflew, and they also, later, they flew way beyond eastwards. It was totally dark. There was a slight cloud base, so they were flying, they could see nothing. And Mason writes this marvelous description. He said, what you expect in a balloon is for freedom, horizon, a sense of everything is quiet and in order. And he said, as the dark, we gradually found we stopped talking to each other, and it closed in on us and became more and more claustrophobic. And then it seemed to become solid. And he wrote this extraordinary passage. He said, we all felt we were flying into a block of solid marble. And this marble would just solidify around us, and we'd be entombed in it. Extraordinary image. If you put your literary hat on, think of entombing in marble. Who might use that? Gothic. Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart. And it turns out, and it's one of the themes of the book, is that Edgar Allan Poe, was fascinated by balloons. His early stories are about flight. And he paid a wonderful compliment to the writer Monk Mason, because after they'd landed successfully, they sailed 480 miles. They came down quite safely, and the story went around Europe. And Poe wrote a wonderful piece about Monk Mason subsequently sailing the other way, right across the Atlantic, from Ireland to the eastern American seaboard. A brilliant account, including Monk Mason's own diaries, including observations made over the period of 4 days. He sold it to the New York Sun. It was a scoop. It tripled the circulation of the New York Sun. Only on the 3rd day did it dawn on somebody that this was a complete hoax. It was an Edgar Allan Poe story. So that's the thing that interests me a lot, and I'm able to follow up also in the direction of Jules Verne, his stories. So we're beginning to open up now. So what you see from a balloon may be quite unexpected things, like the birth of an industrial society. or something else. I hope you can see this. 1862 now. This is the most extraordinary flight, Glacier and Coxwell. The background to this is that Mr. James Glacier was a solid member of the Fellow of the Royal Society, family man, 6 children, splendid mutton chop whiskers, heavily built, definitely a man for the ground, all right? But he was also a secretary of the newly found Meteorological Society, and he decided, in a good scientific thing, we ought to go up and see what there is up there. And so he got funds from the Royal Society to build a deliberate high-altitude balloon. Now remember, people had no idea what there was up there. For example, there was a feeling that if you went into a storm cloud, everybody would be electrocuted immediately. Quite a logical thing, actually. Static electricity would kill everybody. Nobody had any idea how high the breathable atmosphere went. So there were a lot of very frightening unknowns. If you can see a bit that picture, it's an entire Victorian laboratory in there. It's got the latest Italian barometers, which work as altimeters because the pressure reduces as you go up, set them at 0, and then you can count off how high. You get very accurate pressure readings, hygrometers, all kinds of other equipment, a very useful bottle of brandy, which you'll hear about in a moment, and some pigeons on the left-hand side. So, to cut short, this is Wolverhampton. They launched from Wolverhampton, because Wolverhampton had a wonderful gas company, and they did a deal to use coal gas. Very Victorian, this. They negotiated very cheap terms for the coal gas. And the coal gas company were very happy because they knew if it was a success, it would be wonderful publicity. And if it was a disaster, it would be even better. So they got very, very good terms. And up they went to find out what there is up there in the upper atmosphere. They launched at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, September afternoon, perfect weather, cool, about 50 degrees. And they went up to 20,000 feet in this wonderful balloon. That was about as high as anybody had gone, 20,000 feet. And then they were going steadily up at the rate of 1,000 feet a minute. Now, just to give you an idea, Everest, which hadn't yet been climbed, is 29,000 feet and 20, something like that. 29,000 feet is Everest, okay? We all know about climbers in the death zone, which begins around 27,000 feet. They, of course, had no oxygen, nothing. They were just going up blind. At 29,000 feet, so far so good, but they then noticed a little technical problem, which was the rope which controlled the gas release had got tangled in the upper hoop. So Mr. Coxwell, who was the pilot, the man on your left, decided to climb into the hoop to try and release the rope, because if he didn't, they would just go on going up, all right? They would fall upwards. And at that point, oxygen deprivation, which they knew nothing about, started to kick in. Wonderful description from Glacier, who was on that board, he was taking notes of the height, very accurate readings, extraordinary. He produced something like, on the high flying, 1 reading every 15 seconds. Just reading it off time, altimeter, hygrometer, time, altimeter. And he continued to do this, so he knew exactly where they were. But the problem was, he began to find he couldn't read the barometer, little segments on it, because his eyesight was going. He took out a magnifying glass, being a Victorian scientist, and looked at it. And then still his eyesight was blurring. So very sensibly, he reached across the desk there for his bottle of brandy. And then he found his arm lost all muscular power. And then he found he couldn't hold his head up. And then he found his whole eyesight was going. And he realized he was dying from lack of air. And that is that moment of picture. That's him on the right-hand side. Mr. James Glacier slumped back, dying against a basket. There is now Mr. Coxwell in the hoop. The same thing is happening to him. He can't see very clearly. His muscular power is going. And one other thing is happening. It's extremely cold. And his hands are losing all sensation. And in fact, they actually begin to turn black. He gets hold of the rope, the release, the one thing they need. But he can't grip it. His hands are too cold. So he knocks the rope so it falls back through the hoop. He lets himself down by he can't hold anything, by using his elbows across the diameter of the hoop. All the time looking, he sees his great friend, Mr. Glacier, is evidently dying or dead there. But he continues, keeps going, lets himself down. And then I omitted to say one thing. His expert in gas had begun from his early profession, which was that of a dentist. And his dentistry came to his aid at this moment, because there's one way that he could pull that rope. And that's what he did. He grasped it between his teeth, punched his head, and then he heard the gas going, and it released. All right. And the balloon started to come down, and James Glacier woke up slowly. And here, this is the most wonderful account of this, is that Coxwell goes over to the basket, not sure if his friend is dead or not, and shakes him. And what he says to him is, Mr. Glacier, do try and read the temperatures. It's an absolutely genuine account, this. And of course, it's very clever, because he knows he's talking to a fellow scientist. This is the way to get his this will bring him back. Okay? But something even more touching, and this is in the account verbatim I'm giving you. Glacier just begins to stir, and Coxwell says, "Oh, do try, Mr. Glacier." And then he repeats it, do try. And Glacier does indeed start recording. And the result of these very accurate readings proves they went something like 7 miles up, which is way beyond the death zone, and they survived. But they established something absolutely crucial, and crucial to us, and it's a big theme which I open up in the book later on, which is we live in a very fragile planet. And the biosphere, the troposphere, above us is only about 7 miles. That's as thick. The life-giving envelope we all live in is only 7 miles thick. There was no idea of that before this date. These guys, with this extraordinary, crazy courage, established that, and from that a whole series of experiments about the nature of what became the stratosphere, which Glacier developed, and then some very excellent French scientists exchanged between the French and the English all the time, was developed. So that, in a way, eccentric, we were talking about eccentric and what I call incentric, these very eccentric outside the envelope people, and yet he was the family man who's a fellow of the Royal Society, by what we'd now call pushing the envelope, established something very surprising and what science couldn't have projected. And there was an amazing series of editorials in the Times about these two, about what they discovered, and also the whole notion, new idea, that scientific courage was something new. It's very interesting, the editorial, because it talks about the British and their military courage. And it said, but these, Mr. Glacier and Mr. Coxwell, have invented something else, which is scientific courage, which is of a different nature. A very interesting idea about that. Footnote. My book is full of footnotes. It has 49 footnotes. Every footnote is guaranteed to keep you occupied. Right? And the footnote on this is they landed in the countryside near Ludlow, miles from anywhere, but they were Victorian scientists. So they deflated their balloon, and then they walked precisely 7 miles, same distance that they'd gone up, to the nearest pub where they had a pint. Okay. So that's a little gleam of Victorian science. There's a lot more to go on. What I might just, I'm going to leave you because I think we've just got time for some questions. I think that's really important. I want to make one link with Ray's talk, which was New Mexico. If I can find this. New Mexico is important in, you see how much there might have been. Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is not only the home of the bomb, not only very important in the Oppenheimer story, but it's the home of the biggest hot air balloon fiesta, which is at Albuquerque. And I have to tell you proudly, this is my photograph taken in 2010. At a dawn, I was flying with one of the, I was not only passenger, with one of the young woman pilot who'd won the previous year the gas balloon race of America. She was the best pilot. Wow, she was frightening to travel with. And one last thing is what then happened, and then we'll have questions, is you never know with balloons. And I had never experienced, I've been up in balloons in Australia and France, and so on, but I'd never experienced a mass ascent. Very American, this, okay? It's dawn. You just had your waffles, and the sun is just coming up. In this case, on that morning, 400 balloons went up at the same time. Just imagine that in terms of parking problems, all right? You see? So up we went, and we'd actually flown from right at the back of the picture, that green, and we'd overflown everybody else taking off. And I thought, it is very crowded up here. And I thought, what happens, scientifically, physically, if two balloons collide? Full of gas, hot air, not hydrogen, but do they just fold up? And then I realized we were looking as if we were going to collide. And there was a big, completely black balloon, again, true story this, coming up at the same level as us. And for some reason, shouldn't be possible because you're in the same air current. But air current is a very difficult, tricky thing. And they were bringing us together. And I thought, no, it can't happen. Surely it can't happen. We're just going to fold up. So I looked like this across at my woman pilot, cool as a cucumber, just cool. And I thought, either she knows we're going to die and she's not making any fuss about it, or there's something physical I don't understand. We collided. And what actually happened, the two balloons just compressed slightly, and then there was a sort of poof, and they parted again. All right, and we moved. Now, every American balloon, and this is the end of the story, has a name. This big black balloon had a name. It began to turn, and the name tag, it's written right across its belly, gradually came into view. And the name was, remember, we're in the South, Jesus Saves. Okay, that's it. Fine. Thank you. Thank you.
Gosh, I'm not even going to attempt to match the brilliance of those two sessions. So, Ray and Richard, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to say that we have a little bit of time for some questions. So, questions on balloons, questions on bombs, questions on brilliance, questions on eccentrics versus incentrics. Who would like to go first? Virginia.
Richard, I'd love to ask you how the balloons were made back in the 18th and 19th century. I sort of think of them rather about the seamstresses who put them together. I mean, how were these things constructed back then? Presumably there weren't machines to do it.
Amazingly, no, there were no machines at no point. Technology, just very quickly, the very first Montgolfier, remember the Montgolfiers were paper bag makers. And actually, I think their first idea for a balloon was simply publicity. They'd inflate an enormous paper bag, and they proved. And in fact, their first balloons were made of paper, which were held together by buttons. Can you imagine this? They were buttoned together. Later on, they used various forms of silk when they flew over Versailles, and then they developed various kinds of rubberized treatment, okay? And once we get into the 19th century, that becomes more and more sophisticated. And I didn't even get onto this, but the ballooning in the American Civil War, what they made their balloon covers out of is absolutely extraordinary, particularly the guys from the South. And I'll tell you one thing they made, and you'll never forget this, is the South, the rebels, had only one balloon. They couldn't afford any other. And it was called the silk dress balloon. And because it was made from all the dresses of the Southern belles who'd given up their things to make this balloon. And this became the most wonderful propaganda thing. So it also included that, right? Okay.
Other questions? The gentleman over there.
Joseph Rotblat, the nuclear physicist who turned his back on Los Alamos and got the Nobel Prize in about 2000 for peace, declared himself against nuclear war and made all his nuclear efforts towards medicine and spent the rest of his life working on that and pugwash. And he had been with Oppenheimer. Did Oppenheimer ever sort of follow him in a sense and adopt any of those sort of that sense of the need for peaceful use of nuclear medicine or nuclear physics?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. First of all, it is extraordinary that Rotblat was the only scientist who left Los Alamos, because Oppenheimer had got all the scientists there by using the argument, look, Heisenberg is still in Germany. Heisenberg knows full well how to make an atomic bomb. We've got to do this before the Germans do. About a year before the Trinity test, it had become obvious that the Germans didn't have a serious bomb project, and they were nowhere near making a bomb. At that point, you might have expected a mass exodus from the Los Alamos laboratory. The only person who left was Rotblat, and he was shocked by, he'd gone to a party, had a conversation, General Groves was there, and Rotblat was shocked that General Groves said, well, you realise this has nothing to do with the Germans, it's not even to do with the Japanese, it's to do with the Soviets, it's to do with impressing... And Rotblat repeats that story in his memoirs. Did Oppenheimer pursue a similar route? Well, yes and no. I mean, when the war was finished, Oppenheimer's... I said that he moved to Princeton to be on the east rather than the west because he spent a lot of his time in Washington. His main concern was to have an influence on atomic policy. And the most important thing for him was international cooperation. He drew up plans for international cooperation, was deeply disillusioned that the Soviets were not serious about cooperation. He strenuously tried to develop, it had to be an international policy for peaceful use of atomic energy. But he didn't do what Rotblat did, which was to campaign against nuclear testing and Oppenheimer was invited to join the Pugwash movement and declined. He just felt, I think, that wasn't the way to go. He wanted inside influence, whereas Rotblat was happy to be outside, campaigning from the outside. Oppenheimer really wanted to be inside, influencing events from the inside. And as I said, that it didn't work, basically. When it came to the crunch, they preferred to listen to people who were telling them to develop ever bigger and bigger bombs than to listen to Oppenheimer telling them not to develop the hydrogen bomb and telling them to cooperate with the Soviet Union. So he chose the inside route rather than the outside route and suffered the consequences as well.
Another question from the lady there.
A question for Richard. In your over here studies of the 19th century balloonists, you had the nice lady whose husband, or her fiancé, threw himself out to save her. But were there any female pilots, balloonists in the 19th century? Or if not in the 19th century, when were the first women balloonists?
Yes, there certainly were, and I'm sorry, I should definitely have put a picture up of Sophie Blanchard, the great French balloonist of the revolutionary period, who was amazing pilot. Very interesting, she'd had a hopeless husband, Jean-Pierre Blanchard, who was a balloonist of deep eccentricity and inefficiency, and he conveniently died, and she, at the age of 29, then took over the ballooning and proved herself to be outstandingly good. And a very interesting characteristic, she's a very small, rather neat, rather pretty young woman, very nervous on the ground. It was said that she used to jump when noisy carts came down the cobble street. Once she was in the air, she was absolutely nerveless. And what she flew in, the baskets, you think of these comfortable baskets now, I had a look at these. It was not much bigger than a champagne bucket. It came well below her knees. And she did extraordinary flights. Napoleon appointed her the official balloonist of the empire. All right? Now, that was the woman official balloonist. And the brilliant thing is when Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo and the Bourbons went back, she was immediately appointed the official royal balloonist of the empire. Okay? So her story, and there are some very interesting young Edwardian women too, who did the most terrifying things with parachutes and balloons. Again, very interesting, quite tied, who had a big following among a kind of feminist following, actually. Again, very interesting. It's a question I then explore a bit, this question of physical courage. And the fact that the young women had this physical courage quite as much as the young men. Okay, what did that imply? It means you had to rethink your ideas a bit. So there's a whole little strand of social histories there. So forgive me, I do have the most beautiful picture of society, and also Dolly Shepherd. Oh, wonderful. Okay.
I think we should see the picture. I think there's a question over there, gentleman there.
It's been a very long period, hasn't it, of the Cold War, and we're only starting to get half a perspective on it now. But what I wanted to ask you is, at this distance, there's a point of view that the nuclear arms race bankrupted the Soviet Union, and eventually that's a big chunk of what led to the implosion of the Soviet Union and the current existence of the US as the only superpower. To what extent do you think Oppenheimer's politics understood that, given that he was thinking in the sort of 40s to 60s, as opposed to the subsequent era when people continued to escalate it and eventually managed to sort of secure economic dominance?
Sorry, that Oppenheimer understood what?
Well, you said he was very involved politically
Yeah.
in Washington, and obviously there were people who were in the sort of the military who wanted larger weapons,
Yeah.
under the presumption that they were going to be attacked, which
Yeah.
probably now we think is not correct, because
Yeah.
in fact they weren't going to be attacked.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the fact that there was this arms race going on, coupled with the space race, leads you to the Soviet Union spending an increasing percentage of its GDP on nuclear weapons, which it can't afford to do,
Yeah.
whereas the US can. And I just wondered whether Oppenheimer came from that point of view of the politics, or whether he felt it was just important that America was strong.
Okay. I'm not quite sure whether this is what... But there's an idea there that the United States won the arms race, not from any military point of view, but from an economic point of view, as it were. Oppenheimer certainly didn't predict that. From his point of view, the arms race was an unmitigated disaster. It had been what he had gone to Washington to prevent. And so when he saw the United States building ever bigger bombs and the Soviet Union responding by increasing their arsenal, and this whole mutually assured destruction policy that was pursued in the 50s and 60s, Oppenheimer despaired at that. And he didn't see it ending in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Did anybody? I mean, in the 60s, I can't think of anybody that predicted that exactly. George Kennan, I think, said something prescient about, linking that with the economy and saying, look, it's touch and go whether the economy can support that. But no, Oppenheimer's political involvement was all about trying to get some kind of cooperation. It wasn't to do with winning economically or militarily. It was to do with ensuring that no more bombs were dropped. And I think, he had a heavy burden here. I mean, I think it's quite difficult for most of us to imagine what it must be like to have over 100,000 deaths on your hands. And when Oppenheimer met Truman, he said to Truman, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." And Truman was very dismissive and just gave him a handkerchief and said, "Well, wipe them." And then Truman said to his aide, "Look, don't ever bring that crybaby scientist to see me again." But Oppenheimer, I think, was haunted and tortured by that responsibility. He was always asked, "Well, do you regret having led the project that built the bomb?" And his answer was always no, because he was satisfied that it had brought an end to the war. He, like most of the scientists at Los Alamos, could never see the point of the Nagasaki bomb, because that was, from a militarily point of view, from the point of view of getting the Japanese to surrender, that was clearly superfluous. That was designed to give the Soviets the impression that we could just keep dropping these things. And so, the FBI, who followed him everywhere, reported him on the day of the Nagasaki bombings being a nervous wreck. The idea that you could, having seen what happened at Hiroshima, to then have it happen again at Nagasaki completely needlessly, that tore the hell out of him. Yeah.
Well, any last questions? No. Well, I think this is probably the moment to wrap up, and just to thank Ray and Richard for two utterly fascinating discourses. Ray talked about Oppenheimer's brilliance at explaining difficult things to non-specialists, and as a non-specialist in the scientific world, I'd particularly like to thank you, Ray, for explaining Oppenheimer's life inside the centre to me so fantastically, and I'm sure many people would agree with that. And to Richard, to thank you for an utterly fascinating session on the idealism of the early balloonists and current balloonists, and indeed their scientific courage, which I think is something that I will definitely take away from today's session. So a huge thanks to you both for an utterly fascinating afternoon. And I believe you're both happy to sign books in the entrance marquee. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Ray Monk and Richard Holmes.
Very good.